Hey, you want to know more about the Iceman? No, not that one. The Stone Age Glacier dude, I mean. So I recently set up a reward on Patreon that allows people to request video topics and vote on them. And in this case, Ötzi won. So thanks to Vaughn for making that suggestion. I like that one. So let's talk a bit about it. You've probably heard of Ötzi. It's a mummified body found in the Ötztal Alps, which he was named after, in South Tyrol on the 19th of September 1991. And this was quite a massive discovery, very significant. It was right on the border between Austria and Italy. This was the body of a 40 to 50-year-old man who lived between 5,100 and 5,400 years ago. So that was the Copper Age, just a transitional period between the Neolithic, or the younger Stone Age, and the Bronze Age. So he used predominantly stone tools, but he did have a copper axe as well. So they used copper at the time, didn't have bronze yet. So he lay in a rock pit which never thawed completely. So his lower body was submerged in ice the entire time, while the upper body thawed occasionally, partially. So the lower part is most well preserved. And overall, because he was frozen for so long, he was pretty well preserved, and his equipment was also exceptionally well preserved. There are so many significant things about this find. I have to narrow it down, and I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface, because you could fill many hours of discussion with this. And there's been a lot of newer discoveries and different hypotheses that were discussed. Interestingly, there was an arrowhead in his shoulder that severed an artery apparently and caused major blood loss, that was only discovered 10 years after the first x-rays. So Ötzi might have been a semi-nomadic herdsman, judging by his equipment, his clothing in particular, and his diet also. He had a large meal in his stomach, which also took a while to be found. At first they didn't even find his stomach because it was in an unusual position. Things shift, of course, over the years. He probably rested after a long hike, had that meal, and then he was later ambushed. So he had some herbs and cereals and meat from wild animals in his stomach, and also animal fat, possibly from dairy. Apparently he had a number of health issues. Among other things, they found signs of osteoarthritis in his knees, so he was probably dealing with knee pain and inflammation. He clearly walked a lot up and down the mountain and all that. And it also seems he wasn't far away from a heart attack. He had atherosclerosis, which is a plaque buildup inside the arteries, typically due to high cholesterol from meat and dairy consumption. That glorious paleo diet, though. Of course, there's a lot more information about Ötzi himself and his tattoos and all the other interesting stuff about him, but let's take a look at his equipment. So he had a number of tools. He carried a copper axe and a number of stone tools. Those were made of chert. Chert is a fine-grained sedimentary rock high in silica. So it's a very hard rock that when it fractures leaves sharp edges, which of course makes it useful for tools. So he had a short dagger and a bast scabbard, 2 arrowheads, an end scraper, a borer, and a broken chert flake. And then he also had a pressure flaker, an unfinished bow blank made of yew, a leather quiver with 12 unfinished arrow shafts, 5 antler points, a bone awl, tinder fungus, bast cord, and a bundle of sinews. So there's quite a lot. Let's take a look at the axe first. So that one was made of copper from southern Tuscany in central Italy. So it's a bit of distance, and it was made by casting copper into a 2-piece mold, and it was not mechanically hardened, apparently. They did that with some other items in the same time period, so that they didn't know how to hammer it to harden it, but they chose not to, apparently, because it seems like they favored the softer metal for the axe. So I'm guessing the idea is you'd rather have something that bends rather than breaks. So the axe head is 9.5 centimeters or 3 3/4 inches long, and attached to a 60 centimeter or 23.6 inch long U handle. and it was obviously repeatedly used, and there was a fracture that happened from mechanical stress on a casting flaw. The dagger is 13.2 centimeters or 5.2 inches long in total, and it has a 6.9 by 2.4 centimeter long blade. That's 2.7 by 1 inch, and it's inserted into a slit in the wooden handle, and it was just tied with sinew. It was not glued anyway, apparently. And then it also had a plant fiber, well, basically lanyard, the Stone Age equivalent to a lanyard, tied to a groove near the end of the handle. So apparently that's to make it easier to get it out of the scabbard. The dagger blade itself was clearly made by a skilled expert napper, and then the subsequent sharpening was done with less skill. They talked about like medium to good skill as opposed to the very high skill that the original maker had. So Ötzi himself was apparently not an expert napper. Somebody else made it, and then he knew enough to maintain it, to keep it sharp. In order to resharpen a stone blade like that, you actually have to push off small flakes of the material and thereby thin it back out, which also means you lose quite a bit of overall size. If you want an introduction to flint knapping, I have a video about that. I'll link it down below. So you get a bit better of an understanding of how it works. It's a really fascinating craft, I have to say. Anyway, so they found that there was minimal wear on the surface that he retouched. So that makes it clear that he sharpened it recently and didn't get to use it since then. So it must have been shortly before his death. The tip of the dagger broke off during his time, so it could have been either from use or during retouching. It's pretty easy when retouching a piece with a pressure flaker to break it or snap parts of it off, which I know from painful experience. Anyway, so it's a fairly small size compared to many other dagger finds, so that indicates it's probably lots of use and retouching. It might even have had a tang originally, and it might have then been recycled and rehafted, or it might have been made without a tang. It's hard to say. As you keep using it and keep resharpening it, you have to remove quite a bit of material, so the original piece would shrink down quite a lot. And it looks like there were no traces of cutting plants with that dagger. Could have been lost with maintenance if those traces were on the surfaces that he removed to sharpen it. Wouldn't have any remains of that, but it would be odd to think that he used an arrowhead instead of the dagger, because as you will see later, one of the arrowheads actually has some signs of use for cutting plant matter. Then there were the two arrowheads that were both mounted to a split in a foreshaft and tied with plant fiber, then secured with birch bark tar. And one of them was broken. Both the foreshaft and the stone tang were broken. Oh, and by the way, the foreshaft is a common feature from that time. They would just put the point, they would mount that on a shorter piece, and then put that on a longer shaft, so that if the point breaks or if it's lost or anything like that, you wouldn't lose the entire arrow shaft with the fletching and everything. You would just lose that foreshaft or the point, and then you could more easily replace it. Or possibly also you could have multiple points that you can put on right before use. It's just speculation, but could be. It looks like the broken arrowhead was resharpened at least twice, and there are signs of cutting plant fibers with it, and he resharpened the point shortly before he died. And then the end scraper apparently was originally used as a cutting blade, and then it was retouched into an end scraper. And this tool was at the end of its lifespan. You couldn't have modified it anymore or maintain it anymore. So if that dulls again, then you would have had to discard it. And it might also have been used for pyrite striking to make a fire. Then he had a borer, which was also retouched recently without signs of use afterwards, and like the other tools, it can't be reused much more than that, if at all. Then he also had a small flake, which looks like it's broken, a broken waste piece. Normally an expert napper would discard something like that, but he picked it up and apparently still used it. He was also cutting plant material with it, including softwood perhaps. And so you can see that there's a lot of the stuff that he recently maintained, and a lot of it was at the end of its lifespan. So he clearly hadn't had access to chert in a while, and he was just doing the repairs that he could himself. But yeah, his supplies were nearing an end, it seems, or at least as far as the stone tools are concerned. Then the pressure flaker, which is also called a retoucher that he had, is just an antler tine inserted into a handle made of a branch from a lime tree. And this was used to push off flakes to shape and resharpen a tool, like you can see me do in the video link below, even though I'm using a copper nail for that. But yeah, antler was pretty common. Some people think that those pressure flakers were resharpened like pencils. So as the antler tip gets dull, you would just, take a knife to it and sharpen the entire thing. But that would shorten the handle over time and make it so that you have to replace the handle pretty frequently. It would make more sense to actually just pull the antler spike out and sharpen it, and then put it back in and put some kind of filler material in there so it sticks out the same way as before, even though it was shortened. Again, one could talk a whole lot more about his equipment. There are many really interesting aspects about it, but finally let's look at how he died. So it seems that 48 to 24 hours before his death, he received a stab wound on the hand between the thumb and the index finger. So that seems like that would be a sign of a fight, a struggle, and trying to defend himself against a dagger thrust, possibly a dagger similar to what he had. And it looks like he may have lost his original bow and arrows during a fight and then try to replace them. At least it seems unlikely that he would go out on his own on a long trip without a bow. So and he was clearly in the process of making one, and so he may have been trying to replace it. And it looks like it's possible that there were 2 or even 3 separate occasions where he was attacked. Originally, it was thought he was just attacked once, but it must have happened several times, because that stab to the hand happened quite a while before he was shot. So researchers have debated whether he died from the arrow shot to the shoulder that severed an artery. So did he die from the blood loss, or did he die from something else, from blunt impact to the head? Because there is some evidence of brain damage from a hit on the forehead. There's no actual skull fracture, but they found on the inside, some soft tissue remains that would indicate that. So one hypothesis is that he passed out from blood loss after getting shot, and then he was either finished off by the attacker with some kind of club, or he fell and hit his head on a rock. Now, if you look at his position, the way he was found, he was on his belly with the arm kind of awkwardly across the chest. That looks like the attacker might have rolled him over to try to extract the arrow. It's hard to say exactly what happened. If somebody did turn him over on his belly, that would mean that he landed on his back, so he couldn't have hit his head on a rock. So that would have been a direct strike on the head. But it's hard to say. I'm having a hard time believing that somebody actually turned him over, that somebody actually stood over him and even manipulated his body without taking any of his stuff, especially the copper axe, because that would have been extremely valuable at the time. It would have been, a prestigious item and precious item, and it seems very strange that they would leave it there. So I've always thought that it seems more likely that whoever killed him didn't get access to him, like maybe he fell down somewhere and they couldn't reach him, or who knows, maybe they themselves were attacked, or something happened that prevented them from looting him, because this is clearly not a case of, oh, we're going to treat him respectfully. I mean, they clearly just killed him, probably murdered him, and they didn't give him a burial or anything, so they clearly didn't have any respect for him, so why would they not take his stuff? Yeah, so lots of questions still. Somebody had also brought up the idea of ritual sacrifice, possibly, but that doesn't really seem to fit with getting first stabbed in the hand and then shot in the shoulder. I mean, if he was a willing sacrificial victim, he wouldn't have resisted. If he was an unwilling victim, they would have had to capture him and maybe tie him up and drag him there and then, kill him when he was helpless, which clearly didn't happen. He fought back. And I also read somewhere that there was signs of blood from somebody else on his clothing, so he was apparently somewhat successful in fighting back. So yeah, lots of mysteries about that. Anyway, we'll leave it at that because I'm pretty sure the video is already rather long. I'll leave some links to books about Ötzi and his time period down below. And I also randomly stumbled upon a quote-unquote Ötzi knife made by Condor with a steel blade. It's just kind of inspired by the knife that he had. So kind of funny. If you're interested in that, I'll also leave that there just for funsies. If you like the video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Or maybe you want to buy some razor blades. This also helps out the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks.